Great. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Sarah Truitt, and I work for City of Sanctuary as the Schools of Sanctuary lead. And we're really delighted to have this session today, which is going to focus on supporting new Afghan arrivals into schools. We have been collaborating on developing this webinar with a fantastic team over at Refugee Education UK. So I just wanted to remind you of a few things. It would be best if you could all keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation. We will have time at the end for some questions and comments. If you have questions as we go along, please drop them in the chat and I'll be keeping an eye on that and we'll kind of feed that back into the discussion at the end. We'll also be dropping in some links to resources about Schools of Sanctuary more generally and some of the resources and how you can contact those of us who are on the call today. But we're really delighted to have so many people on the call. I think this is probably one of our most highly subscribed events, so it's really great to be here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Catherine Gladwell, who is the founding chief exec at Refugee Education UK, and she's going to get us started on this presentation. But thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to an informative hour.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Guys do as well, but it's really been wonderful to have the opportunity to host this event together with them. And I also, just before we kick off, wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming as well. We've been really blown away by people's level of interest and recognise that for a lot of you, this is probably coming at the end of a long day. So thank you, and thank you for thinking that this issue is important enough. It really does mean a lot. So let's kick off. I'm Catherine. As Sarah said, I'm RE UK's chief executive. But who are RE UK? I think some of you have come across us before, others of you might not have done. But we exist to help children and young people who've had to flee their homes because of war and other forms of persecution to get into school and thrive in school, both academically and in terms of their well-being, and then progress through their education right up to university. And we're running this training today because it has kind of happened that over the last few years, we've built up a lot of Afghanistan-specific experience. So of course, kind of supporting Afghan refugee children and young people through our various programs in the UK, but we've also found ourselves running a monitoring project in Kabul itself for 2 years, analysing education and wellbeing outcomes for returned young people. And also being commissioned by the UN a couple of years ago to start a research project specifically looking at the links between education and integration for young Afghan refugees. And 5 of our senior management team, quite randomly, including myself, have worked in Afghanistan. So it's really great actually to have the opportunity just to share kind of a few brief things from some of those experiences and research with you. We obviously don't have that much time today. We could have designed, I think, a 6-week training course on this topic, but we do really understand how stretched teachers and other education professionals are, and we wanted to provide just kind of the bare essentials to as many people as possible, and this seemed the best way to do that. So what are we going to do with the time that we have got? We will start by doing kind of brief overview of children and families' likely previous experiences, both of displacement and of education. Then we'll look at the most common educational challenges faced by refugee children, and then key strategies, kind of importantly, that you as teachers can implement tomorrow in the classroom to support their education. And we will, of course, not leave you without pointing you in the direction of some additional support that's also available, whether that is from ourselves or from other people. So let's start first with thinking about children's previous experiences, forced displacement and their education in Afghanistan. So firstly, resettlement. I think rapid resettlement is, of course, kind of the backdrop and the context to everything that we're talking about today. And we won't go into this in detail. We're making, I think, the not unreasonable assumption that people have been watching the news and have a basic level of understanding of what has been happening. But I think it is nonetheless kind of worth mentioning that resettlement is normally a carefully planned process. And what these families have experienced is very different to other resettlement programs. And some of you might have worked with Syrian children, for example, who came through another recent resettlement program. What we're dealing with now is something kind of altogether different. So to start with, it's been an intensely accelerated process, so much shorter time frame, much larger numbers. So far, 8,000 plus families have arrived through the Afghan relocation assistance policy. And of course, as you'll know, there's the government's aim to resettle a further 20,000 over the long term, but that is through the yet to open Afghan citizens resettlement scheme, so 2 separate schemes, 5,000 of those this year. That scheme is not open yet, so no one who's here at the moment has come through that scheme, but that's something that we will hopefully see as the months progress. I think the second key important difference to note is that, unlike in other resettlement schemes, there has been zero pre-departure support for these families. All of us saw the kind of chaotic and distressing scenes at the airport. That led to many families arriving with what can really only be described as acute psychosocial and health needs. Including in some of the worst case scenarios, sort of untreated bullet wounds in children, often just with the clothes that they were wearing and a very small bag. So we're talking about people whose whole lives have been dramatically and devastatingly uprooted. And what did they arrive to? In the main, bridging hotels. About a week ago, it was estimated that 13,000 people are still in these emergency hotel accommodation situations. Offers of permanent homes from local authorities are coming in. But again, a couple of weeks ago, it was just over around about 350 homes that had been secured. So you can see that kind of massive shortfall between what's needed and what is available. Of course, there is a shortage of social housing nationally anyway, but the size of the families, 8+ on average, that we're dealing with are making it particularly tricky to find suitable accommodation. Amongst those families, there's also large numbers of really young children. So the most kind of recent estimate is that about, and these are kind of rough statistics, about 40% of these children are preschoolers, about 50% primary, and only 10% secondary. So we're talking about large numbers of really young children in emergency accommodation. They're also dealing with what next. The government is looking at a whole range of scenarios. It's possible that a number of families will have to remain in bridging hotels for a number of months to come. For others, there might be movement between hotels. And for others, the possibility of kind of some form of consolidation in certain areas or clusters, and other families making their own arrangements. But for schools, this of course means a lot of unknowns about pupil movement and the implications of that for planning. In a bit, we're going to think a little bit more about the impact of all of this context on education here and now for these children. But before we do that, we're going to go back just a little bit further and draw out a few relevant points about education itself in Afghanistan before the events of this summer. Firstly, a very brief overview of education in Afghanistan. So available UNICEF stats from a couple of years ago show that attendance and completion rates are, they're relatively low, starkly so at the secondary level as children progress through the education system. Looking at these stats here in this table, they do represent attendance and completion rates for boys and girls, but when those statistics are disaggregated, rates are consistently lower for girls. I don't think that will surprise anybody due to gender norms and kind of expectations on some girls that they won't continue their education as they reach adolescence. Similarly to that, female adult literacy is also fairly low in Afghanistan, and I think that's important in terms of assumptions that we might make about parent engagement as schools. Those are the stats, but what are the key features of Afghanistan's education system that are important to keep in mind as you interact with and support Afghan children as they adapt and adjust to the British education system? Well, we spoke with two Afghan young people who are involved in leadership at RE UK, and we asked them what are the things that teachers should know about Afghan children's education experience in Afghanistan so that they can best support them. Unfortunately, they aren't able to be here with us today, so yeah, you're stuck with me, but I really want to encourage you to read and listen to their full advice on our website. They have really shaped what I'm presenting to you now throughout this training. But Salma, one of these young people, has very kindly recorded a shortened version of her advice note to us. So we're going to listen to that now, and you can then listen to the full version of it at your leisure.
Catherine, we're not hearing the sound on that, but I think you need to, on your screen, oh, actually, perhaps Ashley can do it. She needs to share the share your sound.
Of course, let me try that again.
Everyone, my name is Salma Majid. I'm from Afghanistan, a city called Paktia. My first language is Pashto. I came to the UK in 2014. I did my year 10, year 11, then college, and now I'm at university level studying biomedical science. So hooray, I made it up to here. Because I remember when I came to the UK with no clue how things work here. I was so shy, I was so scared, nervous to speak up. What should I say? I was so even scared if I speak a word, people will laugh on me about my pronunciation, about what I say. So yeah, students, that's the first clue I've just given. So children would be more shy. They would have very low self-esteem within themselves. But I can tell you a secret that Afghanistan children are much stronger, much smarter and clever inside them. It just takes them a little bit of time to speak up and come up with what treasures they have inside them. So it's really important to give a little bit of extra time to Afghan children to allow them to speak up what they are doing. I think mostly they know within themselves what they are doing, but it will take a little bit of time. So giving them more time, the time difference, maybe some students say, oh, why we are a whole day or half day in schools, because in Afghanistan school, the lack of schools building, they have made like 2 or 3 rounds for children to come to school. So one group would be in school education like for 3 or 4 hours, whereas so they can equalize to every single people to go to education. But in here, the schools are compulsory, and from 7 to 8 hours. And over there, it's literally not compulsory at all. As an Afghan refugee, I had a lot of trouble, but with the help of my teachers, I'm here. So yeah, helping children, listening to them, giving them more time and more activities to know them more better. I think they're more talented and more clever inside them. So it's going to take them time to show their own talents, and with your confidence and with your help and support, they will show up. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. Bye bye. Hello everyone, my name.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. I'm glad to, thanks Amy for making the sound work. So yeah, thank you to Salma as well for recording that for us. And I think, you know, obviously her advice is so helpful, but I hope that her story in itself as well is encouraging to you to hear, and it's a reminder of the actually really remarkable educational strides that refugee young people and children can make in a really relatively small number of years when they have the right support and the critical role of teachers in that. So building on what Salma has said, I'm going to just draw out 3 key features of the Afghan education system for you to bear in mind. So firstly, single-sex classrooms. Classrooms in Afghan state schools would most likely and most of the time are separated by sex. So boys would go to school at certain times and then girls at different times. So from that, be aware that girls and boys in your classes may not be as comfortable initially sitting in a classroom with mixed gender. Secondly, and Salma mentioned this, the school day is shorter in Afghanistan. At times that is just due to that kind of shift approach because of the lack of school buildings. At other times it relates to separating out genders, like I just said. But children are typically used in state schools to a half day, and so might not be used to attending the length of school day that we have here. So you may find some very tired children by the time it's getting towards 3 o'clock. And thirdly, teaching and learning styles are quite different in the UK compared to Afghanistan. Generally in Afghanistan, there is more of a kind of a rote learning, memory-focused teaching and learning style that is very much teacher-driven. So it's not traditionally acceptable to challenge or question what a teacher says. And, while of course children will and do kind of quickly adjust to the more interactive and explorative learning styles and pedagogies that we have here, it is important just to realise at first that this will be very unfamiliar to them, and that they might, as a result of that, be more hesitant to fully participate. And so it's just a case of remembering that that lack of participation in activities, particularly the more interactive ones, doesn't indicate lack of knowledge or lack of intelligence or enthusiasm. So 3 salient features of the education system in Afghanistan that are useful for you to be aware of as a backdrop, because they kind of concretely impact on children and their response to our system here. So we're now going to move on to some of the key challenges that might affect Afghan children's education here. Now, we've divided these challenges into academic challenges, things that are concretely about children's learning, and well-being challenges. But we do want to acknowledge and stress that, of course, it's an artificial distinction. These categories are linked, overlapping, and can never really be fully separated. And our well-being affects our learning and vice versa. But it can also be a useful way of clustering things. So I hope that you find it useful. So we'll start with well-being. And in looking at the well-being challenges that these children face, we're going to look briefly at what has happened and is happening. So the common causes of poor emotional and psychosocial well-being in resettled refugee children, and then what you might see in the classroom as a result of this. So firstly, to consider the table here that we've got on the left. 4 key things that Afghan refugee children are likely to have experienced. And you'll notice that I keep using the words likely and may have throughout this training. These things are informed by research and our experience, but of course we don't want to ever generalise and slip into suggesting that everyone's experience is the same. So understand that as just a backdrop to everything that we're saying. So we've all, of course, followed the news from Afghanistan in the last few months, but I think it is really important for us to remember that actually the Afghan people have lived through not just a few months, but decades of conflict and hardship. It's not just us, we've been following the news. And whilst we want to labour that point of distressing experiences that people have had in Afghanistan, I also want to as a bit of a sidebar here, just say that what we see as a result of this in many of the young people that we work with is a really remarkable resilience, determination, and actually also a sense of hope. And so whilst we do need to talk about the challenges, I don't want that other side of it to be neglected or to be forgotten as we do that. So there is the trauma or the distress of the past, but also of the present. Suddenly arriving in an unfamiliar country, being confined to a hotel with little or no indication of when or where you're going to be able to start to rebuild your life is, of course, just immensely destabilizing. And it's repeatedly been described as an additional layer of trauma. And the kind of issue of expectations and reality also comes in here and plays into this. So like almost all resettled refugees, Afghans who have come to the UK would have had an idea about what a life in the UK would look like. And I'm sure that that did not look like being contained to a hotel room for months on end. In addition, they're grieving for the lives that they've had to abruptly give up. the country that they've lost, anxious about others who remain stuck there, and powerless to help the people that they love. Finally, a lot of our research has shown that it's really not at all uncommon for refugee children to feel isolated and lonely, feeling like they haven't got friends, and in some situations being bullied. And I mean, of course, this can be linked to language barriers, finding it hard to communicate and settle in with those around them, and having to adapt to new cultural environments and settings. But what that leads to and what that produces is this kind of overarching sense of isolation and loneliness. So moving from that onto the right-hand side of this slide, what might you see as a result of this? Initially, I'm sure many of you have heard of the fight or flight mechanism, but it is worth just touching on this briefly. So when children have witnessed serious violence or experienced trauma, the fight or flight response in their brains is very easily reactivated, and by things that might seem to be kind of relatively insignificant stressors. But when this happens, the sympathetic nervous system acts like a gas pedal, flooding the body with adrenaline, raising the heart rate, kind of switching off the thinking part of the brain and putting all physical senses on high alert. And when this is occurring, you might see extreme behaviour in the classroom. So, for example, a pupil may suddenly feel angry and hit or push another child, or might complain of physical pain somewhere in their body. It's quite a physical kind of hormonal response. But the flight part of the same mechanism can lead to distance, withdrawal, and also disconnection. So, you might see that a child doesn't want to interact with others, or engage or speak very much. And these might seem like opposite and very different responses, but actually they come from this same kind of hormonal response in the child. The wellbeing challenges on the left can also lead to reduced concentration and focus in the classroom. Children, you might find that children are more easily startled, more easily distracted, or just find certain noises or situations to be unexpectedly triggering. They can also lead to poor sleep, and therefore tiredness and even falling asleep at school. So actually one of the most common struggles that the children and young people we work with face is this kind of battle with insomnia. And of course, when that's going on, the inability to sleep at night leaves them really tired and sleepy during the school day. You can see the sort of cumulative effect when you then combine that with only previously being used to a half day anyway. Lastly, you might see visible distress. At times, as we've said, something might trigger a child. This might lead to them just becoming visibly emotionally upset in the classroom or the playground. And we'll talk in a minute about how we can respond to that. So moving on to the academic challenges in the classroom. So we've talked initially, and just to flag again, how we talked about trauma and psychosocial wellbeing under the wellbeing category, but we want to remember that mental health challenges, of course, impact every aspect of children's ability to engage in education and learning. But what we're going to do now is, drawing on our research and our experience, we're going to look at academic challenges that are very visible in the classroom, and challenges to learning outside of the classroom, which might be less visible. So in the classroom, to start with, I think perhaps the most obvious challenge faced by most refugee children is the language barrier. And sadly and frustratingly for many of you, I'm sure, in many schools, insufficient EAL support to meet the needs that exist. So many schools have found themselves particularly under-resourced in this area since the funding model for EAL changed a few years ago. And it really is a challenge. We mentioned earlier about styles of teaching in Afghanistan being very different to the UK. And of course, if children are expending energy adjusting and adapting to a new curriculum and a new teaching and learning style, then they have a little bit less energy left for the actual learning itself, and might need additional support and patience in this process. And then Lastly, as with any population of children, a number of these children will have special educational needs and disabilities, but these can be much harder to both diagnose and to address in children with English as a second language and with that existing layer of distress or trauma that we talked about. And turning now to the challenges outside of the classroom. For the thousands of children who are still in emergency hotels, there's nothing like an appropriate environment for home study available to them at the moment. Access to the internet and to computers is still very limited for families in many of the hotels, and there are a lot of disruptions. Hundreds of children kind of running around the corridors is what's been reported to us from a number of hotels. But our experience is that even when families do move into permanent accommodation, they may still struggle with access to the internet and with overcrowding. So there can't be an assumption that this challenge of study outside of school will be resolved when the housing issues progress and move on. So secondly, kind of parental support and engagement in children's education and homework can also affect refugee children's academic achievement. And sort of any lack of this is very likely not out of any form of reluctance on the part of parents, but because of the challenges that they're facing themselves, including for some of them their own language barriers, having to look after other children, and of course their own trauma and sense of dislocation. And in this context, even something as seemingly simple as, I don't know, reading a child's phonetic flashcards or reading book with them may well not happen. Possible poverty is another key and obvious underlying issue. Of course, this affects all aspects of a child's life, but specifically in terms of their education, it can affect their transportation to school, their nutrition and the knock-on effects on learning abilities, ability to sort of buy uniform and equipment or participate in extracurricular activities. All of these things that kind of contribute to their overall learning experience and school community, and therefore kind of long-term academic process that children are able to make. Okay, we're going to look now at some of the strategies and interventions that are compassionate and effective that you as teachers can adopt in response to some of these challenges that we've been looking at. It's been important today to look at what some of the kind of research evidenced most common challenges are. And particularly because I'm sure that what you're experiencing at the moment, if you are in a class that has already got a lot of Afghan children in it, or if you're just perhaps getting ready to have Afghan children in your school, is a sense of, gosh, there's so much there, where should we start? So I hope that kind of understanding what some of the most of research evidence significant challenges are can help create that framework of where to start, and that from that we can now go and look at what are the most effective strategies that you can adopt to support these children to thrive in their education. Important, of course, to say that as we talk about these strategies and these principles, no one size fits all. We're making these as suggestions, things that are backed up by research and evidence, and that we've seen time and again work in other situations. But take the time after this training just to consider your own environment and what some of these things might look like for you and the school communities that you're part of. We're going to first look at some key principles for interaction that underlie everything that is about to come. We're then going to look at teacher approaches. So as a teacher, if you are a teacher or if you're not a teacher, how you can support teachers to kind of undergird all of the practical things that they will do. And then practical interventions themselves, the very concrete things that can be done. So starting with the kind of key principles for interaction, we're going to just draw on a bit of research to think about key principles for when we're working or engaging with refugee children. I will keep saying as a teacher, probably, but in saying that, I do want to recognise that there's very likely people on this webinar who are engaging in other areas of education. So please do just take the principles that I'm explaining and apply them to your own work stream as best you can. Most of them are fairly easily transferable. So, of course, as a teacher, you aim to build trust with all of your children and parents, but it's proved really important to us that schools keep this in mind, in particular with refugee families, as it tends to take longer than you might be used to. And as Salma suggested in her voice note earlier, it's really important to have patience and perseverance with this. And again, as she said, you really do have a unique opportunity to set what is a really valuable example of welcome and special care, helping children and their parents to really feel seen and listened to in their new environment. And now this next thing will likely be very much in line with some of your school's behaviour policies anyway. But nonetheless, when the challenges are particularly acute, it can be worth just pausing to remind ourselves once again to look beyond the visible behaviour to what might be causing it. So, i.e., remember all of the stuff that we've just been talking about in terms of context and challenges that these children are facing kind of right then and there in the moment when it's kicking off. In terms of language, of course, children with little or in some cases zero English language are going to struggle immensely to start with. But, and I really can't emphasize this enough, low-level English language is not synonymous with low-level intelligence or academic ability. And that might sound obvious, but our experience is that again and again, if a child has limited English, then talents that they have in other areas, maths or music or whatever it might be, are overlooked. Fourthly, and this is actually one of my favourites, try to see a refugee child's presence in the classroom as an opportunity for the other children in the class to learn more about compassion, widen their worldview, not a burden. And I say this as a parent of a 5-year-old in the reception class of an inner London primary with a number of newly arrived refugee children in her class. And she has been kind of on the sort of what's the phrase? She's been on the kind of hard end of some of the fight or flight mechanisms at times. She has been pushed, she's had her hair pulled by one of these children who has himself experienced violence. And although she was kind of, obviously upset by this, she came home and she said to me, "Mummy," name of child, "he's seen some not nice things and he's still learning how to be with his friends. And Miss L asked him to say sorry to me and he did, and I said it's okay." And I was really proud of her teacher for the way that it was handled, that somehow the teacher had managed to communicate to her that the way that this child was reacting wasn't about her or their friendship, but was about something that he had experienced, and that she'd done that in an age-appropriate way. So my daughter, age 5, is learning about the world in a real way, but in a way that is appropriate to the stage that she's at. And that wouldn't be happening in the same way if she didn't have some refugee children in her class. And linked to that, kind of taking that a step further, I would really just want to encourage you just to recognise that resilience and look for that resilience that we talked about earlier, and adopt an assets-based approach and mentality to having refugee children in your school. So there's a school just down the road from us that has a very large number of refugee children in it. I don't want to give an exact figure because I will inevitably get it wrong, but I think it's upwards of 70. And teachers that work with large numbers of refugee children in mainstream schools have told us again and again how the culture of their school has been positively changed by the presence of these children. And so I think when you're in this early stage of kind of navigating something that is new, I would encourage you where you can to remember that and to think about the long-term enriching that will happen in the lives of your students and in your school community as a result of having resilient and by necessity adaptive refugee children in their midst. So on paper, these principles might feel quite straightforward, but we know that they're going to look different in different schools and in different classrooms. So before we move on, I'm just going to stop talking for 30 seconds and we're going to have 30 seconds of quiet. If you want to turn your screen off for 30 seconds, feel free. And I just want you to think about, pick one of those principles and just visualize what that would mean for you to do something different in your work next week or next time you're in a situation that relates to what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds now, and then we'll carry on. Okay. I hope you're able to think of at least one thing that you might be able to carry forward from those principles. And I think that creates a nice kind of bridge for us from talking about principles and general approaches to going on to looking at some concrete things that we can do. We're going to start on the concrete things by looking at teacher approaches to some of these challenges. Firstly, teacher approaches to responding to the fight or flight mechanisms. So when you're in a situation like this, it's important to make sure that you move slowly and calmly and speak in a gentle voice. These kind of simple physical things actually can really help to de-escalate the situation. And also can be really important in terms of creating a safe space for the child. So as part of this, maybe consider calmly moving away from other children in the room. Yourself or another staff member could go for a walk with the child in the playground, if that is possible, to get some fresh air, perhaps a TA. Having time to talk, difficult though it is, can be a really important part of creating a safe space. As Selma kind of stressed, the teachers play an important role in helping children adjust to their new environments. And you or teaching assistants or other school staff might find that where these children have experienced significant stress or trauma, you are someone that they might open up to, sometimes unexpectedly. And as you will, of course, know from all of your safeguarding work, it's really important that they feel listened to and valued at this point. But it is also important that you feel able to balance this and your own needs and your classroom environment. So if you're able to and feel comfortable listening to the child at this moment, then ensure that you're in or can move to a quiet place. If you don't have the time or the appropriate space to do this, then make sure that you know, or if you know that you're unlikely to be able to do that whenever it arises, make sure that you know where you can direct the child to, either in school or, if that's not available, outside of school, where they can safely talk. And of course, it goes without saying that you would share your concerns with the school safeguarding coordinator when something comes up, whether you were actually able to listen to the child in the moment or not. Linked to that and kind of building on that, simple tasks and actions can also be really helpful in terms of restoring that sense of calm in the moment. So something as simple as giving the child a glass of water to drink, or asking them to do a very simple task, can you tidy this box of pencils for me, can be really helpful in just letting that adrenaline and kind of cortisol leave their bodies. So a few pointers for dealing with the fight or flight related behaviour in the moment. Another thing in terms of teacher approaches, it is really important to have and to build an awareness of what sensitive topics are for the children that you're working with. So certain seemingly normal topics may well be triggers and often are triggers for refugee children. You don't have to avoid talking about these things completely, but you do want to be aware that mentioning particular topics might be triggering or might require time to speak with young people about in more detail, and may lend you to needing to refer on to appropriate interventions. So that can be things including talking about family, talking about journeys to the UK, and probably quite obviously talking about the situation in Afghanistan. But it's particularly important, I think, to mention, as what we found and what a lot of teachers have said to us is that these topics are some of the obvious things that we kind of reach for, particularly talking about family, to make conversation with new pupils and with students when language levels might be low. So it's just particularly important to be aware that a simple do you have brothers or sisters could be triggering. For example, families were not allowed to bring children aged 18 or over with them as part of the resettlement process, and a number of families there have older siblings who have had to remain in Afghanistan if they're 19, for example. Okay, so responding to fight or flight, thinking about sensitive topics, and creating time to talk in the midst of that. We're going to look now, having looked at the principles for interaction, reflected on them in our own context, and then thought a little bit about teacher behaviour. We're going to share some concrete ideas for things that your school can be doing to support Afghan refugee pupils. And a lot of these things, although they will support Afghan refugee pupils, they will also be really supportive for any refugee students that you might have in your school community. And we're going to consider interventions under 5 key areas. So firstly, could you consider some peer support interventions? So our research shows that creative approaches like buddy schemes can make a really big difference to refugee children's ability to settle in. So you could match an Afghan child with another student, same sex ideally, considering their previous experience. Or if you have other children from a similar language or cultural background in your school, this can also be helpful. But most importantly, match them with a child who is welcoming and who is friendly and who has a kind of attitude of welcome. Buddies can do things like showing children around the school, introducing them to friends in the playground, making sure that they're included in games, and talking to them about the classroom, showing them where different things are. Secondly, there are key things that you can do to help children with their adjustments to their new school environment. So some of the school rules or customs that might seem basic may be really unfamiliar for children. So, for example, take the time to explain what their timetable is, their uniform and kit for different activities, what it means when you take the register, where there are breaks, where there are lunch times, and key behaviours that you want to see in the classroom. And to promote stability, which is kind of particularly important for these children, given what they've been through. Where possible, make every effort to minimise teacher or class changes for them, so that they really can build that sense of familiarity with the people that they're surrounded by at school. And keep them informed about upcoming events or activities that are taking place at school in advance, so that it's not something that is a kind of destabilising surprise on the day. Strong pastoral care and wellbeing support is also, of course, incredibly important. Make sure that the child knows who in your school they can turn to if they want to talk to someone. That might be a teacher, it might be a specific other staff member in the school. But take the time to link up newly arrived children with the appropriate internal support mechanisms, and also, if you've got access to it, external support. Fourthly, everything that we've mentioned will help make your school a more welcoming and inclusive place for these children. But there are other things that you can do to build that sense of welcome and inclusion. So, for example, and I'm sure almost all of you will do this already, but for schools in some regions where they maybe don't have a particularly sort of diverse range of backgrounds within their students, thinking about cultural and religious needs, such as halal food, religious holidays, things like that, is something that can sometimes go unconsidered. You can also ensure that there are visible signs of celebrating diversity. So, welcome boards with hello in different languages, and making sure that that includes Pashto and Dari at the moment. Taking the time to learn how to pronounce a child's name accurately. Tiny things, just examples of small things that go a long way to showing that you care that a child is there and that you want them to feel welcome and included. As we mentioned earlier, language is often a key barrier to children's education. And of course, language support is important. And in the context of sort of diminishing resource for this at school level often, really want to encourage you to make the most of resources that are kind of externally available. I would really encourage you to look at the Bell Foundation, the resources that they have on their website, and the multitude of expertise that you can sign up for there with them, and of course NALDIC, who have a lot of advice sheets, ideas for creative interventions, language interventions for EAL students. We have come across a surprising number of schools in recent weeks who have got significant numbers of refugee children in their number, and yet have no dedicated EAL support within the school, and who haven't been aware of some of these resources that are available to them externally. So if you are in that position yourself, or if you're not in that position yourself, but in touch with others who might be, then do signpost them to those two really brilliant organisations. As a school, there are also some other things that you can do, even if you don't have that much resource. Could you consider setting up a lunchtime or after school language support club for children? Could you ask parents at your school if they would be willing to volunteer as reading buddies or sort of phonetics buddies for newly arrived children? One of the schools that we work with does this. It takes each parent who's signed up only half an hour each week, but it makes a real difference to the amount of one-to-one support that these children can get. Are there, for some of the schools, additional Pashto or Dari speakers already in the school community who could help children too in this way with additional academic support? See what resources you've got at hand to help with this language acquisition that children need to do as quickly as possible. Finally, and this is building on the idea of language support, academic support more broadly. As we've said, sometimes other academic gifts that children have can be overlooked, and so taking the time to make sure that they are getting additional support through in other areas of academia is really helpful. We run a program in this area that is an educational mentoring program where we match children and young people with community volunteers who meet up with them every week and do a kind of blend of tutoring and wellbeing support with them. Now, this program was designed for teenagers, and we're in the process at the moment of considering how can we adapt this to make it appropriate and safe for younger children. And if that's something that you'd be interested in finding out more, then please do sign up for our newsletter. And as we sort of expand and develop that program, we will we'll share information about that. Okay, they are some practical interventions that can support children. We're now going to think about practical interventions that can support parents, because as we've said, this is really critical for the way in which children either are or are not able to progress. So firstly, again, language support. It's critical that parents receive support with English language if they're going to be able to support their children in their education. We would encourage you, if you can, and if it's necessary, to consider using interpreters for key early stage meetings with parents, such as parents' evenings, for example. But we recognise, obviously, that does come at a cost. But we have worked with schools that have found informal ways of doing this with other families who speak Pashto or Dari that are in their community, and others who have just decided to fundraise and invest in doing that. If that is not possible, Google Translate, readily available on a tablet for meetings like that, if you've got parents who have got literacy in their own language, can be fraught with challenge at times, but also helpful and better than nothing. It's worth considering if there is any possibility of translating key information about the school and key newsletters that have things like term dates and stuff like that into key languages as well. Again, recognise that that's not always possible, but we've seen it bear real fruit where it has been able to be done. And all of these things will make a difference to how engaged families are able to be with their children's education as they themselves grow their English levels. In terms of helping families adjust, many aspects of the British education system will be new for Afghan children and their families. So, for example, interventions and strategies that might help in this period can include things like organising tours of the school for parents and guardians. Obviously, we're coming out of the COVID time when that's not been possible for anybody, but actually it's a really, you can't overvalue, I don't think, the importance for a parent of being able to actually visualise where their child is in the day and understanding what that environment looks like. Plan in sufficient time for discussions with parents and building positive and supportive relationships with them. As Salma said, patience and trust are really key. Again, some of the basic rules around length of the school day, that it's compulsory, as Salma said, to go to school and that children do have to go every day, might not be familiar to these families. And so allowing time when children arrive to spend time, someone from the school, with the parents, with language support, to emphasise these things can be really helpful. Another important aspect for helping families to adjust is building space and time for social activities. And again, realise that for a lot of schools this can be challenging, but we have worked with schools who have run breakfast clubs for parents, or run informal English classes even themselves for parents, or who have set up schemes where they have connected refugee parents with other parents in the school who are kind of, known to be friendly and welcoming and seem open to making a connection and befriending other parents. Finally, consider providing support for parents and guardians around technology that they and their children will be expected to engage with. Do not just assume that because you have sent an email out with details about all of the passwords for the different platforms and apps that you use to communicate about the school, that they will be able to do that. And I speak as a parent who, as a kind of, university educated, English as my first language parent, has struggled to get on top of all of the platforms that I need to engage with as a parent. If you've got intermittent access to the internet and low levels of English language, and low levels of access to the actual tech that you need, it can be really challenging. Some schools that we have liaised with have invited families to a session where they actually physically walk through the different platforms with them, getting them to log on, getting them to activate their accounts, exploring how they navigate those together. And that's been really invaluable to do that in person rather than just assuming that it is happening. Finally, of course, you don't have to do this on your own. And this is just a brief thing, but to say, do look at what organisations locally to you are able to help, because there will be people, and Schools of Sanctuary, of course, a wonderful initiative. And if you represent a School of Sanctuary already, you will probably already have good connections with organisations in your local area that can help you to support the families or the new arrivals that you're working with. And in closing, I really want to stress in all of this the importance of self-care when working with refugee children, particularly those who've been through traumatic experiences and might still be struggling with that. Remember that all of us have got limited capacity. Being a teacher is stressful at the best of times, and vicarious trauma is a real thing. So when you are being exposed to this through the children that you're working with, and when what you're having to take on is going beyond the scope of what you would normally face in your day-to-day, prioritise the little things that you know will help with your own well-being, whether it's a chat with a friend, a good coffee, a run, and don't be kind of shy to talk to someone professional if you need to. you need to look after yourself for the long term if you're actually going to be able to support children in the way that they deserve to be supported. As promised, we've got a number of links that you can explore for further information. You can look at our welcome page on our website for Afghan refugees. That will link you to a welcome pack that we have produced that actually addresses some of the challenges that we've talked about in this session around lack of familiarity with the English education system, and goes through kind of section by section what is expected of parents and children and what they are likely to find when they start school. You'll be able to soon find an online version of that, and it may well be that the families that you're working with have received hard copies already in Dari and in Pashto. We've had several thousand sent out by local authorities just this week. And of course, if you've got questions or you'd like to discuss any element of this training in more depth, then please do feel free to get in touch with us at the email address there. We run a number of other trainings, which we'd be really delighted to see any of you out on more kind of niche aspects of education. This has really been a kind of whistle-stop tour just to cover the basics. And you can find a whole other range of resources and information about supporting refugee education in the UK more broadly, including all of the research studies that I've mentioned in this training on our website. So it's got gradually darker in this room as I've been speaking, which reminds me that it is time for me to stop talking, and just to say thank you so much to all of you for caring enough to come to this webinar, and for taking the time to do what you can to invest in the Afghan children that are either in or imminently likely to be in your schools. And thank you again to Sarah for organising.
A big thank you, Catherine. That was a fantastic session, so informative and really rich. We've had a lot of great sort of comments and some questions coming through on the chat. I know it's late, it's getting dark. I can hear my own children downstairs, but there are a couple of questions that have come up. So I just thought if we could just, I'll share some of the ones I've caught. My colleague Megan can catch me if I've missed any. There was a comment a little bit about, and I'm not sure if you'll know this is fairly niche. Do you know if there's any resettled families that have come to Northern Ireland, and if you have any contacts with organizations that are supporting them there?
That's a really good question. I don't know, but I could find out and would be really happy to pass on that information. I know that actually, incidentally, kind of the education, there are various government figures in Northern Ireland who are very proactive on supporting refugee children's education. So I almost hope that the answer is yes, because I imagine there'll be some great initiatives coming from there.
Fantastic. We also, someone had a question about sort of, you mentioned as one of the things that can help new arrivals get support is a buddy program system. And there was a question about research on that, and if there is some, academic information on buddy programs and how they work. So I'm hoping maybe you can help us, find that and direct it to the.
Yeah, so the first thing that I would direct you to is a study that UNICEF commissioned us to do in 2018 that looked at buddy systems as part of that. So again, I think we're going to do a follow-up email to if you are all happy for us to contact you, we'll do a follow-up email from this session, and we can share links to some of these research pieces in that, so that you don't have to kind of go searching around our website looking for them yourselves.
That's fantastic. Another question is the slides you've shared today, which have been so useful, can we also share those as part of that follow-up email?
That's a great idea. Yeah, I will check with, I just need to check with Salma that she's happy with that. But yeah, great suggestion.
That's great. A lot of people shared some fantastic resources in the chat, and we also have a number of resources on our Schools of Sanctuary website. So we'll try and compile them, not put in too many, recognizing people's limited capacity, but thank you to everyone who dropped in resources. The links to NALDIC and other places were really helpful. We also had a question, I think it might have already been covered, but in terms of the pastoral care concept, which is probably a bit different between the US, which is where I'm also from, and the UK context. I don't know if you want to comment on the need for pastoral care, though, just in light of the fact that someone asked, in the US context, it tends to be more religious, but in the UK context, it might have a different meaning.
Yeah, I'll maybe just give one example from one of the schools that we work with, and this is again, it's an inner London school that has really quite limited resources, but one of the things that they have invested in is a therapist who is based in the school. She's by training she's a dance movement therapist, but she actually provides a kind of safe space for all kinds of forms of like talking and non-talking therapies and support for children. And this is a primary school, so they've done it in a way that it really works for really young children. And so, of course, within that, she's not explicitly dedicated to supporting refugee or even migrant children. It's any children that need that support. But she has got that additional expertise, and she actually used to be one of our volunteer mentors. So she's also been through our training, and does a brilliant job in kind of combining that all together. And I think a number of schools have that post. I think what is critical is just making sure that the person who is in that post has that additional layer of expertise or attends training or whatever on specifically supporting refugee and asylum seeking children, so that they can join the dots between their practice and the needs that these children have.
That's great. That's fantastic. There was another question that came in about working with the school's library services, and if you could maybe suggest which languages are most useful if we're trying to buy books to support schools. This person said they have some books in Farsi, but other suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now for Afghan children, Pashto and Dari, with the welcome packs that we've produced, we've been working on a kind of 60% Pashto, 40% Dari ratio, which is a sort of rough estimate based on first language of people who are being resettled. In terms of other really common countries of origin, if you can have books in Arabic, you're obviously hitting quite a few countries. Eritrean languages has been another language that's been useful. Also Albanian lately has also been quite a useful language. That is, though, I say it as the caveat, that is off the top of my head, and I could just look up the kind of top 5 countries of origin of refugee children and give you a more exact answer. I would expect those countries to feature.
Fantastic. I'll give it, I don't see any more questions. Oh, someone mentioned perhaps Urdu as another option as well. But thank you for giving some off the top of your head. I don't know if there's anyone who have any sort of final thoughts or questions. I know it's kind of late in the day for teachers, particularly who've had a long day in the classroom. But I just don't want, if there's any sort of questions, you can do a quick raise your hand or drop it in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing any, but we do have a couple screenfuls, so I'll just quickly flip through. Well, if nothing else, there's been some fantastic comments and feedback in the chat. We'll be saving this. And I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's late in the day, but it's really great. We've had a tremendous turnout, so I'm delighted to see so many here. And most importantly, a huge thank you to the team at Refugee Education UK and you, Catherine, in particular, for presenting all this really informative information. We, all of you who are on the call and work in school, aren't currently a school sanctuary, to consider maybe incorporating becoming schools into your practice of support for refugees and asylum seeking children. We have lots of information and lots of support to help you on that journey if you want. We'll be in touch with some follow-up. The recording with this will be available on our YouTube channel soon. And thank you for being